Dead Stone Valley by J. Wilburn. Sister was her name. She mounted up on a horse named Myth she had only ever ridden once before. While the men gathered at the head of the trail, marked by skulls left on purpose, they continued to argue amongst themselves. She began her ride down the sloping trail where they dare not follow. Okay, they paused in their arguing long enough to stare at her back. She kept her spine straight and her eyes forward so they'd see her leaving tall. A smile brushed her lips, making the deep wrinkles around her mouth even deeper. She was an only child and orphaned very young, no one to lose if this trip into the deadly valley proved to be her last. If she did not return, they really would have something to argue about then. The grass still grew high and green along both edges of the dirt trail here. In amongst the bent grasses were all manner of equipment and discarded gear. Anyone behind those warning posts above her could walk a few steps down to rummage through any of these things. Sister wasn't sure whether these things were cast off at the beginnings of journeys or the mad ends of them. Either way, no one was going to dare to even walk this far, and she was already loaded up as much as she'd need. She thought about the stories of people climbing the highest mountains in the world. They get sick from lack of oxygen and would abandon each other and everything they carried as they wandered to the top, half frozen and out of their minds. This valley certainly wasn't the deepest in the world. If it were any other place with any other history, it wouldn't be that perilous of a journey at all. Perhaps the air closer to the bottom was as deadly as the thin stuff at the top of the world, but she bet more people died down here than up there, even including all the years of previous civilizations. She'd learned to ride among strangers because she had no family and had made much of her living on horseback ever since. She had grown old in the saddle. She thought she would surely have died from age, exposure, or a bandit's pistol before she would ever be asked to handle the Dead Stone Valley business again. Sister considered the fact that this might be the moment she began her final ride on her last mission. Hell of a thing to know you were dead already, but she'd thought that before and had been wrong. Not exactly now, but in some lower elevation soon, it would be proven one way or the other. She did venture a glance backward. The men were back to arguing, nothing much new there, and at least their attention was off of her. She wasn't exactly in a rush to get to the bottom, but she made good time and distance that first day. Myth had showed no signs yet of being skittish or ready to throw her and bolt. There was still a ways to go, obviously, but most other horses would have already turned tail and would be turning tail and bucking. A special few could handle the ride, maybe not the whole way, but far enough. Sister paused after gathering scrap wood and dried grass for her fire that night. There were no strange noises yet, no voices on the wind, no whispers in her head at least. The problem tonight was that there was no noise of any kind beyond her lonely camp. All the natural creatures outside this valley had stopped before the warning posts as well. Aside from her horse's breathing, everything else from insect size on up had abandoned them in silence. She dared to speak and her voice sounded flat in the darkness. I guess it's just the two of us tonight. Some people spend their whole lives trying to find silence like this. As she set the fire and cast a little flickering light against the darkness, she reconsidered whether this was the silence others actually sought. Despite the fire, Sister ate a cold dinner and a cold breakfast the next morning as she stomped out and covered over the last embers. Mounting up again, Myth still showed no signs of wanting to rear and flee, so Sister continued her downward trek to in the first pastel rays of morning. She walked beside the horse, holding its reins for much of the afternoon. They ate and drank that way as well. She only pulled from the canteen, but allowed Myth to drink from the trickling creek. The water originated from outside the valley, so she thought it might be safe enough for now. Sister wouldn't drink from it, and she'd rather not risk the horse either, but this was a long trip still. They rested between eating, but continued a steady trot much of the day. Well before evening, the grasses turned from yellowed to white and stiff on both sides of the trail. The horse the horse stuck to the middle and snorted a bit more, with its eyes rolling from side to side. It still obeyed her forward commands, but Sister knew that obedience would be collapsing soon. It seemed early for the White Death to be this thick around them. She had made good time both days, but she didn't think it was that good. The death must have crept higher in the valley. If it was spreading, would there be a time when Deadstone Valley could no longer contain its evil? Sister didn't want to imagine such a day, or what the days after that onward creep might look like, but that seemed to be the way with unaddressed evil. She supposed she was here to address it, but not to solve it really. And that truly was the problem with dealing with evil things. They passed the hulking rib cage of some great beast several feet off to the left of the trail at a switchback bend. Myth bobbed his head, but kept the steady trot as they left the monster's bones behind. She heard no whispers and smelled no death on the wind, but Myth might already be picking it up in the breezes over that white grass. Sister had seen many bones like this before. She was fairly sure those had not been here the last time she took this trail long ago. Things big and alive still stalked this terrain, and something had killed it. Maybe that shock white poison grass, or maybe something else still hunting. As she set up for her second night in the valley, Sister kept her loaded guns on her hips and a rifle near her side. She tied Myth down with 2 ropes and set up her spot for sleeping beyond the range of those ropes. She did not expect Myth to trample her in the night, but as the death crept, so did the madness. She decided not to take the chance. The next morning, Myth pulled and thrashed from side to side. His eyes rolled wild to the whites, and the pink that ringed those were looking yellowish with mucus. Sister finally steadied the animal. She probably could have ridden him successfully for another day or even more, but the beast was already showing signs. While he was still calm, my nose is itching. While he was still calm, she removed the saddlebags and the saddle itself. She left the saddle and even some of the supplies in the center of the trail. She tied on the other bags, a blanket, and the water as she prepared to walk the rest of the way. Lastly, she untied Myth from the final rope around his neck, very much like a stay of sentence. To the horse's credit, he stood steady and awaited her orders despite his mounting panic. She would never ride him again, however. Sister turned the animal around and pointed him uphill. "Go on now, I'm not going to beg you to leave me, so go if you're going." The horse bobbed its head once and then galloped off without her. Before it broke into a full run, it dropped a healthy pile of manure. Sister watched Myth go and said, "You're welcome." The truth was the animal might not make it the 2-day journey back to the top. He stood a better chance at survival than she did going the other way. Sister turned downhill and started walking what would now prove to be a longer journey on foot. She walked through the day until the grasses turned black. They looked burnt, but still stood up like they were still growing, or trying to. Bones of all shapes and sizes littered the valley walls on both sides of her and the narrowing trail as far as she could see. Sister kept her head down and walked through the evening and into the night. She stumbled off the trail with the black grass making the night even darker and harder to see. The grass felt like it was grabbing at her each time she lost the trail. That was nonsense, but as her eyes tried to adjust to the night, the whiteness of the bones stood out in pockets all across the ground. "Something killed them," she mumbled to herself. Smarter to stop, but she kept going, one shuffling step after another. More than once, Sister caught her foot in a rut or an ancient root or some great track and fell to her face. One time she hit hard enough to clack her teeth together. If her tongue had been between them, she would have bitten it right in two. But she got up and kept going deeper into the dead silent valley. As dawn broke, memories of the previous endless night seemed like a dream to her. Her legs hurt far too much for that to be true, but night delirium still seemed too surreal in morning light, even down in this deadly place. In the light, she thought maybe she had fallen 2 or 3 times at most. The haunted images in her memory said it was much more than that, and something in the grass had tried to grab her each time she strayed. At midday, she came upon 3 cabins that held together with more gaps than boards in their remaining structure. She could see the weathering and time-bleached furniture that still stood inside. A black swatch of growth in one exposed interior corner could have been the last rotting remains of a mattress upon its collapsed wooden frame. She had been this way before and remembered abandoned cabins, but these did not look familiar. It was possible that there had been more in the past. Maybe those collapsed entirely, and these were on their last legs. She sat down in the middle of the trail and dozed off, sitting up. Sister startled awake to the swampy smell and came up to her knees while drawing her gun from one hip and thumbing back the hammer. A clicking noise circled around her. As her head cleared a bit from thick sleep, she saw there was nothing to shoot outside her dreams. Sister took a deep draw through her nostrils, searching for that swampy stink that had awakened her. It wasn't that the smell of wet rot wasn't there. It was just far enough in the background to almost be dismissed. She stood with her supplies still strapped onto her aching frame. The hammer remained pulled as she searched the patchy ground around her for something she knew had nowhere to hide. Nothing. She walked down the trail away from the cabins backwards, stumbling once as the heel of her boot caught on something. She kept her footing and still walked backward. Spying the movement in the corner of one of the surviving cabins, she stopped and took aim. After several moments, she still didn't understand what she was seeing. The rotten black mattress was breathing, or so it appeared. She could not decide if it was some living thing underneath that mass, or if the black substance she thought was a moldering mattress was in fact the living, breathing thing itself. Finally, she thumbed down the hammer, holstered her gun, and turned her back on that shape. Whatever it was, she wanted distance between it and her. Sister tried not to think about the idea of having to come back this way if she survived the trip down. As night fell, she made modest camp again. 3 times she nearly fell asleep, but something drew her awake. The last time she stood and drew her weapon again to wait for whatever stalked her to show itself finally. As time went on, but the noises of close movement continued, she decided there would be no sleep tonight. Sister gathered her things while watching her dark surroundings, instead of watching where she tied knots for her gear. She imagined the black shape of the mattress crawling with its swampy stink over the dark ground toward her. There were much worse things down here she probably needed to be worrying about, but that was the thing that stuck in her mind. She had seen it breathing in broad daylight. She had fallen asleep in the trail too close to it. "It has my smell," she whispered. There was no way she could know that, or even know if such a thing mattered, but it rang with a dark, fearful truth in her ears and her head. It started to drizzle rain as she descended. Sister fitted her hat down on her head. She ascertained that her sleeves were pulled down over her gloves, so no skin showed. The restless tapping tried to lull her asleep on her feet. She staggered a couple times, but kept awake and kept walking. Sister continued her blundering nighttime hiking until dawn, when she allowed herself to sit again, but not really sleep. Bleached spots of yellow-white speckled the brown leather of her coat, gloves, and hat. None of it appeared to have gotten to her skin. If a heavier rain came later, it might be trouble. She didn't eat much that day, even though she knew she should. She had to fight to keep from drinking too much of her dwindling supply of water. She walked around shallow puddles she found in the trail. Sister thought she was seeing more bones in the winding trail ahead, where the ground had gradually started to level out. As she drew closer to it, she realized it was something else. This was not the ribs of a fallen beast, but a white stone bridge across a creek bed. She was further along than she'd realized, but still had a long way to go. Before she reached the bridge, movement off to her right pulled her attention. Her hand dropped to the butt of her weapon, but she didn't draw. Not for the first time on this trip, she took a moment to understand what she was seeing. It wasn't a deer, and it wasn't any sort of antelope or moose. The thing was covered in shaggy brown fur and stood twice as tall as her. It had dozens of points on each antler and snorted at her as it turned its head from side to side. The eyes were dark and featureless, but they held a quiet level of intelligence that she didn't like. She did not appreciate this intelligent thing considering her like this for this long. The creature stood in a lonely patch of green in the otherwise barren valley that now looked like a desert of volcanic ash. Whatever mutated thing it was, it did not appear unhealthy. Only 2 eyes, just the one mouth, and 4 strong legs. It could have been any natural thing, but wasn't such a thing as she had ever seen. The beast lurched, and she almost drew on it, but then it twisted to the side, bounded across the land, kicking up dark gray dirt, and leapt across the creek bed. It continued its run to a larger patch of green farther from the trail in the valley. Sister continued onward and crossed the white bridge. A lot more abandoned gear piled on both sides of the bridge and into the dust off the trail. Halfway across the bridge, she saw 3 skeletons hanging from frayed ropes. They all looked human except for the larger one with 4 skeletal arms hanging out of its rotting canvas coat. By the bits of decaying meat and dry hair hanging from the strung-up bodies, she guessed they had been hanged at different times. "Did you hang yourselves, or did someone do it for you?" she asked. The bones shared none of their secrets. Sister continued onward day and night. She wanted to say it was one night. That would have made sense from this bridge, but like before, she thought the number might be higher. Maybe as many as 4 nights, but she decided she would be out of water if that were true. In the darkness of those undetermined nights, she saw different sorts of skeletons. The concrete splinters of long fallen towers jutted up from the ground at broken angles off to one side. The concrete ruins showed perfect rectangular holes for windows. These ruins were older than the collapsing cabins further up. In the daytime, the light glinted off something ahead. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself forward anyway. Even if it killed her, she needed to finish this, or some poor soul would have to follow her down soon. The silver bell showed itself ahead over the next rise. She continued on. The temptation to run was there, but not the energy to follow through. It was farther than it looked. She tried to remind herself of this. As the day wore on, she did get closer to it, even if it was excruciatingly slow. "Please let me get there before dark," she sent up a dry prayer. Light flashed before her eyes. In reality, she knew it was inside her head. This was something she remembered from before. Red light filled the world, colored everything, and bled over all the blurry details. Then it was green. Blue followed. Colors without names tried to blind her. Colors returned, but never that bloody, lusty burst of red again. Sound cut in sharp and painful from inside her skull as well. There was no blocking your ears from a sound coming out of your own head. Below that shrill drone were the whispers finally, the voices not the least bit human. They whispered words not invented on this world, maybe from no dimension even close to the reality they enjoyed outside this valley. She came upon the object so suddenly that she almost tripped over its curved edge. With the screeching inside her skull, she feared if she fell on that silver hull that her brains might melt right out of her ears. Sister circled the thing to the open hatch. Despite the screaming in her head, she leaned inside anyway. Colorless moss and lichens clung to the open doorway and grew around the surfaces inside. Stringy things like gathered cobwebs blew back and forth from where they hung from the ceiling. Those strings seemed to be reaching for her as she reached into and across the dark interior of the object. She squinted her watering eyes and tried not to think about what she was smelling. Her fingertips found the button that vibrated through her glove, but it held stiff like the thing had grown stuck over all the years down here in its cursed valley. Finally, it did relent to her weight, and the button pushed all the way in. Sister almost fell, but she almost didn't have the energy to right herself, but finally she drew back outside. As she wavered on her feet, she noticed the silver hull of the object had lost much of its sheen. It might have been made of dull stone from the look of it now, but the hatch was still there and open as it always would be. The noise inside her head had stopped, the whispers no more than a memory she couldn't get back to, but her skull pounded with throbbing pain. This evil thing had come from another world and had nearly ended this one. A thing with buttons probably had drivers as well. Sister rolled her eyes at the clear sky and the empty land. She wondered, not for the first time, if those creatures who crashed here might not still be living in this valley, stalking those who came to push the button periodically to buy the world a little more time. Maybe stripping bodies down to the bones in those discolored grasses above. She turned and saw a set of train tracks curving away from her and the object. The uneven wood ties underneath that rusting metal had turned green. Sister bet if she touched those rails after all these years of that metal being this close to the evil energy of the object, she might die on the spot and become a skeleton herself. She wiped her nose on her sweaty sleeve, and it came away bloody. The bleached specks on her coat and gloves had turned to tiny holes that bored straight through to her skin. She didn't bother to check her hat. Sister pinched her nose with one hand and rested the other on one of her weapons. There we go. I should have left that plural. I remember changing that today, and I was wrong. Not waiting, she started her weary journey back out of the valley. Passing those concrete splinters in the daylight this time, she tried to imagine what people lived there before this valley had been cursed. She walked through one night and collapsed the next day on the White Bridge. When she woke up, she decided she had just been sleeping and had not fallen down to die as she originally thought. Over the following days, she watched for movement in the discolored grasses, but only saw the bones. There were a lot on the way down, but she swore there were even more on the way back up. And she thought she heard the whispering again. She tried to tell herself it was just the grasses rubbing together in a breeze she couldn't feel. In the daylight, she saw more stone ruins that perhaps she had missed in her nighttime wanderings before. Sister drew her gun before she reached the cabins. There was a smell, but different from before. The furniture and the last of the walls shook in the light breeze. That black breathing mass she had thought was a moldering mattress was gone. Sister continued along the upward slope, not intending to stop anywhere near that sight. She watched the ground for movement and startled at every shadow. When she reached the saddlebag she had dropped upon releasing the horse, the other supplies were torn open and devoured. Sister sighed, but decided it was fine. She would die of thirst long before she died of starvation. If something found her, she'd be done long before that. There was a track in the middle of a pile of drying manure. It was thin and appeared to have 6 toes. A day later, she came upon Myth. The horse lay... Pardon me, I'm sorry. A day later, she came upon Myth. The horse lay on the side of the trail a few feet into the sick white grass. When the horse gave a shuddering breath, she stopped in her tracks. Then she saw the black sludge creeping and crawling over the top of Myth as the horse suffered, half alive. She came forward and fired one shot, having mercy upon the animal. The black sludge screeched at her, but kept feeding. Sister emptied the first weapon into its dark, shapeless form. It crawled off the dead animal and shivered through the grass toward her on the trail. It gave off hissing sounds that could have been escaping air bubbles or the creature's anger. A clicking noise echoed around her. She holstered the empty and opened fire with the other pistol. With 2 shots remaining, she prepared to haul the rifle off her shoulder next. The sludge thing roared and moved to the side. Sister stood ready to fire again. The sludge paused as if considering it, and sped off through the white grass away from her. Sister's boots had never moved from the spot where she stood when this fight began. She holstered her weapon, saving the last 2 bullets in there, affording only a short look to poor Myth. She continued on. At one point in the following night, she collapsed and expected to be consumed as she blacked out. It was still dark when she awoke, and she walked through to the light again. It was still morning when she came into view of the warning posts at the head of the trail and the top of the valley. She had the overwhelming temptation to shed off everything she still carried in those last few feet. She opted to drink the rest of her water instead. As she did so, Sister felt certain those posts would waver and vanish like the hallucinations they were. One more whisper passed through her head, and she almost understood the words. As she closed in on the end without the vision of those posts disappearing, two young men jumped up from the lush green grass where they had sat waiting on the morning watch. Perhaps they were left over from the previous night. They stood watching her final steps and waited. As she passed the skulls finally, they accepted all the gear Sister shed. One young man held up the blanket to the light and inspected all the holes through the material. One large hole looked like a clawed handprint. Two edges of the material appeared chewed. They had two horses. Sister climbed on one without a word and laid her head against its neck. The men held the reins and walked along beside the animals as they trotted away from the valley.